He hadn't spoken to another human being in 11 days. Then he heard a child scream. On an empty Texas road, he found a little girl, 7 years old, barefoot, with a twisted foot and bruises shaped like a grown man's fingers, pinned against a rock pile by a coyote. He killed the coyote. He picked her up. She weighed almost nothing. But what froze his blood was the crumpled paper in her hand. 5 children's names. 2 of them crossed out. Someone had been counting these kids like cattle, and the ones with an X were gone. He brought her to town. The next morning, the most powerful man in the county, a respected judge, showed up at his door with a peach pie and a warm smile, offering to take the girl. But the moment that little girl saw his face, she went stiff with pure terror. She knew him, and what this broken drifter doesn't know yet is that 30 miles south, locked in a building with bars on the windows, that same judge has a ledger. And written inside it is the name of his own son. This story teaches us that sometimes saving someone else is the only path to saving yourself, and that the bravest thing a broken person can do is stop running and choose to stand. Welcome to Westwind Tales, where the dust of the Old West carries stories of sacrifice, redemption, and the fierce kind of love that grows between broken people who refuse to give up on each other. If frontier stories with real heart are what you're looking for, you've found your place. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. Now, let's begin.
Imagine you haven't spoken a single word to another soul in 11 long days. Then, out on a dusty, empty Texas road, you hear a child scream. You ride toward that sound and find a little girl, maybe 7 years old, pinned against a rock pile by a coyote. She is barefoot, she is starving, and she has a twisted foot she was born with. And wrapped around her small arms are bruises shaped just like a grown man's fingers. You take care of the coyote, you scoop her up, and she weighs next to nothing. But what truly freezes your blood is the crumpled paper clutched in her hand. It has 5 children's names written on it. 2 of those names have an X next to them. Someone has been counting these kids like cattle, and the ones marked with an X are no longer part of the herd. When you bring her to town, the most powerful man around, a respected judge, knocks on your door holding a peach pie and a warm smile, offering to take the girl off your hands. But the second that little girl sees his face, she turns stiff with pure terror. She knows him. And what you don't know yet is that 30 miles south, locked in a building with bars on the windows, that same judge has a ledger. And in that ledger is the name of your own son, the son you thought you lost forever. Welcome to Cowboy Dusk, where the West gives up its real stories of grit, sacrifice, and the kind of love that grows from nothing. If you came here for frontier stories that stay with you, then you are in the right place. This tale teaches a hard truth. Sometimes, saving someone else is the only path to saving yourself. It shows that the bravest thing a broken person can do is to stop running and finally choose to stand their ground. It reminds us that love is not a single act of rescue. It is a choice you make every day, made by flawed people who just refuse to quit. If this story has already got you holding your breath, hit that like button and tell me down in the comments. What would you have done on that empty road? Share this with somebody who needs to know it is never too late for a new beginning. And if you are not subscribed, tap that button and ring the bell, because every story we tell here is one you will not want to miss. Now, let us begin. Cole Brennan had not spoken to another human being in 11 days, and he was starting to like it that way. Words took an energy he just did not have. Talking required a type of showmanship he had long since stopped pretending to have. Silence was simple. Silence passed no judgment. Silence never gave him the look Miriam did that final morning, a look that said she had already buried him in her heart and was just waiting for his body to follow. Then a sound sliced through the oppressive heat like a knife. A child screaming. Not just crying, not the whimper of a lost kid looking for their mama. This was the raw, throat-shredding scream of something small and helpless that had been cornered by a predator. That sound found a place deep inside Cole, a place he had spent 3 years trying to drown with whiskey and quiet, and before his brain could catch up with his instincts, he was already digging his heels into Maverick, urging him into a full gallop. The Texas sun was a blistering white dot in a washed-out sky, beating down with a heat that made the very air tremble and the ground bake hard. Cole had been on the move since sunrise, riding north from a cattle drive that had left him with $14 for 3 weeks of swallowing dust and misery. $14. That was enough for 2 weeks of living lean or 3 days of hard drinking. He had not yet made up his mind which way he would go, though his hands had started shaking yesterday morning, and the flask in his saddlebag was calling to him like a siren. The land was flat and had no mercy. Cracked earth stretched out to forever in all directions, with only scrub brush and the odd, stubborn mesquite tree breaking the monotony. The carcass of a dead cow lay about 50 yards from the road, swollen and black with a storm of flies, its ribs pushing through skin stretched tight as a drum. Even the buzzards seemed defeated, perched on a fence post with their wings hanging low, just waiting for the heat to let up before they bothered with their meal. This was the heart of Texas in September of 1882. The land did not give a damn if you lived or died. It just waited. Cole came over a low limestone hill, and then he saw them. A coyote, all mangy and desperate-looking, had trapped something small against a jumble of rocks. That something was a girl, a little thing, no older than 7. She was backed up against the stones with nowhere else to run, her mouth wide open, making that awful scream, her hands thrown up in front of her as if her little fingers could somehow stop a mouthful of teeth. Between her and the coyote stood a dog, a scrawny mutt so thin you could count its ribs, and not even half the size of the coyote. The dog was barking its heart out, snapping and lunging, trying its best to hold its ground. It was a losing fight. The coyote faked a move to the left, the dog scrambled to follow, and for a split second the girl was wide open. Cole pulled his Colt and fired. The gunshot cracked across the silent land like a bullwhip. The coyote folded in the middle of its stride, dead before it even hit the ground. The sound of the shot rolled across the flatlands and then vanished into nothing. And the girl stopped screaming. It did not fade away. She did not slowly calm down from panic into relief. She just stopped, as if someone had reached inside and cut the sound right out of her. Her mouth snapped shut. Her eyes went wide and empty. Her whole body went rigid, her hands still up, her fingers still spread. She was there, but she was also gone, retreated to a place inside herself that Cole knew all too well. It was the place you go when the world gets to be too much, and the only refuge you have left is the quiet darkness behind your own eyes. The little dog stopped barking and started trembling, pressing itself tight against the girl's legs. Cole put his revolver back in its holster and swung down from his horse. He moved slow and deliberate, making his actions small like you would when approaching a spooked horse. His boots made a crunching sound on the dry earth as he walked toward her. Getting closer, the terrible details sharpened into focus. The girl's dress might have been nice once, a blue cotton thing someone had sewn with a careful hand, but now it was torn and caked with grime, hanging off one of her shoulders. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, matted with dirt, and what looked like dried blood near her left temple. She had no shoes on. Her left foot was turned inward at the ankle, her toes curled under, the whole foot bent at an angle that made Cole's stomach turn over. It was not a fresh injury. It was something she was born with, a club foot that had never been properly set or cared for. On her forearms, he saw the bruises. They were not the kind of random marks a kid gets from playing rough. These were perfect ovals, spaced evenly apart. They were the exact shape of an adult's fingers, squeezed hard enough to leave a lasting impression. Cole crouched down about 6 feet from her, close enough so she could hear him, but far enough not to be a threat. The little dog let out a low, steady growl. The girl put a hand on the dog's head without even looking at it. The growling stopped. "You hurt?" Cole asked. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together, raw from so many days of silence and dust. The girl's eyes moved to his face. She looked at him the way a cornered rabbit watches a hawk, trying to figure out the distance and the odds. But she did not reply. She did not even open her mouth. She made no sound at all. She was not deaf, though. He saw her flinch when his horse, Maverick, shifted his weight behind him, and the saddle leather groaned. She could hear just fine. She was choosing to be silent, using it like a weapon. It was probably the only one she had left. Cole looked around him. The road was empty as far as he could see in both directions. There was no wagon, no wisp of smoke from a campfire, no sign of any other person for miles. But he did see tracks. He stood up and walked a slow circle around the pile of rocks. The girl's eyes followed his every move. The dog's eyes did too. He found what he was looking for about 20 yards to the east of the road. Wagon tracks. They were not the deep parallel grooves of a big freight wagon, but the lighter tracks of a buckboard. 2 horses had been pulling it, judging by the hoof prints. And here was the detail that made Cole's jaw clench so hard his teeth hurt. The tracks came down from the north. They stopped right there, right beside that pile of rocks. And then they turned right around and went back north. The horses had stood still for maybe 5 minutes, just long enough for someone to get down, unload something, and then get back up. Then they just drove away. This was not a child who had wandered away from her family's wagon. This was not a family so poor they had to leave a mouth behind, with tears and prayers and a faint hope that the good Lord might look after her. Somebody had put this little girl on a wagon, driven her out to this God-forsaken patch of nowhere, set her down by these rocks and just left her, on purpose, the way you would get rid of something you did not want anymore. Cole made his way back to the little girl. She hadn't stirred an inch. He squatted down in the dust again. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said softly. "I know that don't mean a whole lot coming from a fella you don't know. But I'm fixin' to pick you up and set you on that horse because if you stay here tonight, you're gonna die. And I just can't let that happen." The girl just stared at him. You could see something turning over behind her eyes, a kind of figuring that no 7-year-old ought to be doing. Then, she did something Cole knew he'd carry with him for the rest of his days. She loosened her left hand. Just a little. Not all the way open. Just enough for him to see what she was holding. It was a crumpled piece of paper squeezed so hard and for so long that it was molded right to the shape of her palm. She wasn't giving it to him. She was just letting him know she had it. A secret. A treasure. The only thing in this whole wide world that was hers. Her right hand stayed balled up, tangled in the dog's fur. Cole gave a slow nod. "You can keep that. Whatever it is, it's yours. Nobody's gonna take it from you." He moved over to her side and slipped his arms under her. She weighed nothing at all. Lighter than a feather. He could feel every rib through her torn dress, feel the sharp points of her shoulders where they should have been soft and round. The dog let out a low whine, but didn't try to bite. The girl didn't put up a fight. She just went stiff in his arms, every muscle locked down. Her jaw set so tight he could see the tendons in her neck standing out like baling wire. He carried her over to Maverick and eased her into the saddle. Her twisted foot hung at a bad angle and she flinched when it brushed against the horse's side, but she never made a sound. Cole swung up behind her, his arms making a sort of cage around her small body as he gathered the reins. She sat straight as the fence post, refusing to lean back on him, refusing to give in one bit. The dog sat on the ground, looking up at them with worried eyes. "Come on, boy," Cole said to the dog. "You too." The dog trotted up beside Maverick and they all headed north, toward Bitter Creek, toward whatever was waiting for them down the road. Cole had lifted the girl onto his horse. She was light as a puff of dust. The dog followed without a word needed. And somewhere on that burnt-out piece of road, Cole Brennan either made the biggest mistake of his life or the best choice. He wouldn't know which for a good long while. Clara Abbott was elbow-deep in Martha Greer's hard labor when the stranger came riding into Bitter Creek. He had a silent child and a half-starved dog with him, and Clara knew it, the way she always knew things she'd rather not, that the careful life she had built for herself was about to fall to pieces. She didn't see him ride in. She was in the back room of the Greer farmhouse, 2 miles west of town, talking Martha through a breech birth that had been a struggle since midnight. The baby was turned all wrong, and Clara had her hands inside this poor woman, trying to feel for a foot to pull on, her voice steady and calm while Martha hollered, and her husband wore a path in the hallway. The world had shrunk down to nothing but blood and sweat, and the stubborn will of a new life. The baby finally came into the world at 12:30 in the afternoon. A little girl, her face purple and full of fury, screaming about being brought into this world. Clara cleared her mouth, tied the cord, wrapped her in a clean blanket, and laid her on Martha's chest. The screaming stopped. The room fell quiet except for Martha's shaky breaths and the little wet sounds of a newborn finding her mother. Clara washed her hands in the basin, using a stiff brush to scrub the blood out from under her nails. Her back was aching, something fierce. Her eyes felt like they were full of sand. She had been up for 20 hours straight. But she smiled at Martha because that's what you did. You smiled and said the right words and pretended that bringing a new life into the world was enough to make up for all the ways the world would try to break it later. She rode back to Bitter Creek in the early afternoon, with the sun beating down like a hammer. Her horse carefully walked along the dirt path that the town called its main street, passing the saloon, the general store, and the little clapboard church with its crooked steeple. Bitter Creek wasn't much of a town to look at. Maybe 150 people if everyone was home, most of them ranchers and farmers trying to make a living from land that didn't want to give it. 1 street, 1 saloon, 1 general store, 1 church, and 1 jail. Just the basics of civilization, and not a thing more. Clara made her first stop at the bank. It was her habit every time she came to town. She walked inside, stood at the counter, and asked Mr. Pritchard for an update on her application. "The judge will get to it when he gets to it, Mrs. Abbott," Pritchard said, the same tired line he gave her every single time. These things take time. These things. The ranch. Henry's ranch, which should have been her ranch, which Henry had lost in a string of card games so wild and desperate that Clara sometimes thought he was trying to lose it all. The bank owned the deed now, and the bank had to have Judge Keene's signature on any land sale over 50 acres. And Judge Keene was a very busy man with a lot to do, and Clara's application was just one more piece of paper on his desk. Clara gave Mr. Pritchard the same smile she gave everyone else. It was polite, it was controlled, it gave nothing away. "Of course," she said, "I understand completely." But she didn't understand. She would never understand it. That ranch was the last piece of proof that her life with Henry had been real, that it had all meant something more than a lie and a bullet, and a secret she carried around like a rock in her heart. Henry Abbott had not died from a riding accident. Henry Abbott had put his own pistol in his mouth on a Tuesday morning in November, while Clara was 3 miles away delivering a baby. She had come home and found him in the barn, still sitting in the chair, the gun on the floor next to him. She had stood there for a long time, long enough for the blood to turn dark, long enough for the flies to come buzzing, and she had made a choice. She cleaned that barn from top to bottom. She dragged the chair outside and set it on fire. She threw the gun into the creek. And then she told everyone that Henry's horse had bucked him off and he had hit his head on a rock. A proper widow got sympathy, but the wife of a man who took his own life got something else. She got whispers. She got doors closing in her face. She got folks assuming she must have driven him to it, that a good wife would have noticed something was wrong, that there was something broken in a woman whose husband would rather be dead than be with her. So Clara lied. And the lie held. And she had been living inside of it for 2 years, keeping it up like a fence, checking for weak spots, mending the holes, making sure the truth never got out. She was tying her horse up outside Rosa Delgado's saloon when she heard the gossip. 2 women were on the boardwalk, their voices low, but not quite low enough. Rode in about an hour ago, a big fella. Looks like he's seen some hard miles. Got a little girl with him, but she don't say a word. And a dog that looks like it ain't had a meal in a month. Whose child is she? Nobody knows. He says he just found her on the road. Well, I found her. Just like that. Just like that. Clara stepped through the doorway. Rosa's saloon was a cool, dark refuge, thick with the smell of old tobacco, cedar planks, and the ghost of sweet mescal. Behind the bar, Rosa stood, a small woman with features as sharp as a hawk's. She polished a glass with a rag that had seen its last good day long ago. Her dark eyes saw everything, and she had a tongue that could peel a man's pride right off his bones. "You heard," Rosa stated, not bothering to ask. "Tell me everything." Rosa put the glass down on the counter. "He is a drifter, calls himself Brennan. Claims he was a ranger once, but from the looks of him, he has been formerly a lot of things for a good long while. His hands have the shakes of a man 3 days shy of a drink. His eyes look like someone blew out the lamps and walked away." She took a breath. "But Clara, the way he holds that little girl, the way he keeps his body between her and that door. That is not the look of a man who took a child. That is a man who stumbled onto something he cannot name but knows he can never let go." "Where is he?" "In the corner booth. He has not asked for whiskey, and that tells me one thing. He has not asked for food, and that tells me another." Clara saw him right where Rosa said he would be. He was a big man, no doubt, wide in the shoulders, burned by the sun, dressed in clothes that had been patched too many times and not nearly enough. His hat was on the table next to a glass of water he had not touched. His eyes lifted as Clara came near, and she saw exactly what Rosa meant. The fire had gone out. There was a familiar emptiness in his gaze. It was the look of a man whose body was still walking around long after his spirit had laid down to die. The little girl was perched on his lap, not nestled in but held stiffly. His arms were a cage, but she was not leaning into the bars. The girl's eyes were the oldest Clara had ever seen in a child's face. Beneath the table, the dog rested its head on its paws, watching every move. "My name is Clara Abbott," she announced. "I serve as the doctor for this town, more or less. I need to take a look at the child." "Cole Brennan," the man rumbled, his voice like gravel scraping on rock. "She does not speak. I figured as much. And she is a biter." Clara turned her gaze to the girl. The little girl stared right back, her expression not quite fear, and not quite defiance, but something else entirely. She was sizing Clara up. "May I?" Clara asked, directing the question to the girl, not to Cole. The child's eyes flicked to Cole, then back to Clara, then down to the dog. She reached a hand down and stroked the dog's head. The animal rose and climbed into the space on her lap, a warm buffer between her and the man. Only after the dog was settled did the girl offer a single thin arm to Clara. Clara took it gently and started her work. The child was badly dehydrated. Starvation was plain to see. Her clubfoot was from birth and had never been tended to. The bones had set crooked long ago, and the muscles were withered from fighting an ankle that would never be straight. There were bruises on both her forearms, the clear shape of fingers. Some were yellowed with age, others were a fresh, angry purple. A round scar sat behind her left ear, the kind left when something hard and blunt makes contact. Her fingernails were broken on both hands, torn clean off down to the raw skin, the kind of damage a person gets from clawing at something, or someone. And then Clara saw the paper. It tumbled from a fold in the girl's dress as she moved, a crumpled ball of paper damp with sweat from being held so tight against her skin. The girl moved with a shocking violence that made everyone jump. She scrambled from Cole's lap and dove for the paper, snatching it from the dusty floorboards. She clutched it to her chest, her eyes wide and wild, her mouth stretched open in a scream that made no sound. "From you, it is all yours. The girl from you, it is all yours." The girl pressed herself back against the wall, the paper held to her chest like a prayer, the dog a solid weight against her legs. Slowly, ever so slowly, the frantic look in her eyes faded. She slid down the wall to the floor and just held her paper and breathed. Clara had only seen the document for a second, but a second was all it took. There were 5 names written in a tidy, grown-up hand. An age was listed next to each name, and next to 2 of those names was a simple X. Clara's eyes met Cole's across the table. He mouthed a single word so softly that only she could have caught it. Inventory. Somebody had been counting these children like a rancher counts his cattle. The names with the X's next to them were the ones who were no longer part of the herd. Clara sat back down at the table, across from Cole. The girl stayed on the floor with her dog, her paper, and her silence. Outside, the Texas sun beat against the saloon windows, a physical presence wanting in. This child was not simply lost, Clara said, her voice low. No, ma'am. And she did not get those bruises from a fall. No, ma'am. Where did you come across her? Cole told her the story. Out on the road, the coyote, the wagon ruts that just stopped in the dust and pointed back the way they came. The whole thing felt planned, deliberate. Clara listened, her hands clasped tight on the tabletop, her expression unreadable while her thoughts raced a mile a minute. She can stay with me tonight, Clara offered. I have a spare room and plenty of medical things. You can bed down in the shed out back if you need a roof. I am not leaving her side. I am not asking you to leave her. I am asking you to sleep 20 feet away instead of in the same room. Whatever that child has lived through, what she needs tonight is the presence of a woman. Cole's jaw tightened. He did not care for the idea one bit. But then he looked down at the girl on the floor, at how she had folded herself into a tiny ball, how her eyes darted around, tracking every single movement like a cornered animal. He gave a sharp nod. The dog stays with her, he insisted. The dog stays with her. The 3 of them left the saloon together. Rosa watched them go from behind the bar. As Clara walked past, Rosa said something that stuck in her mind like a burr under a saddle. Another family signed their boy over to Judge Keene's guardianship program just last week, a 10-year-old. Keene says the boy's headed east to learn a proper trade. Rosa's voice was light, conversational. Her eyes were anything but. It is a funny thing, though. Nobody ever seems to get a letter from any of those children once they go east. Not one single letter. That evening, Clara watched from her window as Cole sat in the doorway of the shed, the moonlight glinting off the revolver he was carefully cleaning. She had seen the flask in his saddlebag, but he did not touch it. Not even once. She could not decide if that made her trust him more or less. A man fighting his own demons is a wild card in ways a man who has already lost the fight never is. Sometime during the night, the little girl stole Clara's bread knife. Clara found it tucked under the pillow, wrapped neatly in a torn strip of her petticoat. The handle was pointed out, ready for a quick draw. She was 7 years old, and she slept with the readiness of a soldier on watch. Clara stood in the doorway of the spare room as the gray morning light crept in. She looked at the knife and felt something inside her chest crack right open. The child was on the floor, not in the bed. She had dragged the blanket from the mattress to make a small nest for herself in the corner nearest the door. Her back was against 2 walls, and the dog was curled around her body like a living shield. Even in sleep, the crumpled paper was clutched tight in her hand. She had chosen the floor over the comfort of a bed, the corner over the open room, the side by the door over the one by the window. Every choice was a calculation for escape. Every instinct was honed for survival. This was not a child who had been lost for a few days. This was a child who had lived with fear for so long that fear itself had become the house she lived in. Clara took the bread knife back to the kitchen without a sound. She put a pot of coffee on to boil and stood by the window, watching the sky shift from dark gray to a pale, washed-out gold. She thought about the names on that list. 5 children, 2 of them crossed out. Someone's inventory. A ledger of human souls. She thought about Judge Solomon Keene and his special program and all the children who went east and were never heard from again. She poured herself a cup of coffee, drank it black, and fought the urge to reach for the laudanum bottle in the cabinet above the stove. Cole showed up at the back door an hour after the sun was up. He looked like he had been through hell. There were dark circles under his eyes. His hands were trembling worse than before, and his forehead was beaded with sweat despite the cool morning air. The withdrawal was hitting him hard. Clara had seen it plenty of times in men who came to her after a long binge, shaking and sick, swearing they were done with the bottle for good. Most of them made it a week. Some made it less. "How is she?" Cole asked. "She is asleep on the floor with my bread knife." A flicker of something crossed Cole's face. Maybe it was pain. Maybe he recognized the feeling. "I'll talk to her about that knife." "No, you will not. She took it because she felt she needed it. When she feels safe, she will give it back on her own." Cole opened his mouth to say something back, then he shut it. Clara was learning that he wasn't a dumb man. He was stubborn and hurt and probably dangerous. But he wasn't dumb. He knew the difference between a woman giving a suggestion and a woman telling him how it was going to be. "Coffee?" Clara asked. "Please." They sat there at her kitchen table, drinking their coffee without a word. About 20 minutes later, the little girl appeared. She dragged herself into the doorway on her hands, her twisted foot useless behind her, with the dog trotting right at her side. She stopped right there on the threshold and looked at them with those old eyes, searching for any sign of a threat, the way a general looks over a battlefield. "Morning," Cole said. The girl didn't answer. She looked at Clara's table, at the 2 coffee cups, and at the empty space where a third chair sat. Then she crawled over to the corner of the kitchen, pulled herself up to sit on the floor by the stove, and leaned back against the wall. She put the dog in her lap and just watched them. Clara put a plate with a piece of cornbread and a cup of water on the floor next to her. Not up on the table, not on a chair, down on the floor at the girl's level where she could reach it. Then Clara backed away. She had learned this from years of bringing babies into the world. You never forced anything. You made an offer. You gave them space. You let the scared creature come to you. The girl looked at that plate for a long time. Then she picked up the cornbread and broke it clean in 2. She gave the first piece to the dog. She ate the second piece herself in tiny, careful bites, chewing every one, making it last. She didn't touch the water until every crumb of the bread was gone, and then she drank in slow, measured sips, controlling herself, making it last. It was plain to see this child had been starved. I do not mean she missed a meal here and there. She had been starved on purpose, over and over, long enough for her to learn that food was something you had to save, something you had to hide, something that might not ever come back. Clara watched the little girl eat, and a feeling tightened in her chest so much it hurt to draw a breath. The rest of the day was just one small train wreck after another. Cole tried to pick the girl up just to move her from the kitchen out to the porch. She was not having it. She bit down on his hand so hard it drew blood. He hollered and dropped her, and she scrambled backward across the floor faster than you would think possible, with that twisted leg of hers. She put her back flat against the wall with the dog standing guard between her and the whole world. Cole just stood there, blood dripping from his hand, looking at her. Clara saw his face go through about 6 different kinds of hurt before it finally landed on a look of pure shame. "I should have asked first," he said. "I am sorry." The girl just stared at him from behind the dog. She was breathing hard, her little fists balled up, her whole body shaking like a leaf. But she did not make a sound. Not a scream, not a cry. Nothing. That silence was louder than any noise she could have made. Later on, a gust of wind slammed a door shut. The crash was loud and sudden, and it sent the girl into a million pieces. She dropped right to the floor, curled up in a tight ball with her hands covering her head, and just trembled. No tears, just shaking, with her mouth open and her eyes squeezed shut, every muscle in her body locked up tight. She stayed that way for a good 20 minutes while Cole sat on the floor about 4 feet away. He did not touch her, did not say a word. He was just there, The dog laid down across her legs, a warm, heavy anchor to keep her on this earth. When the shaking finally stopped, she did not even look at Cole. She crawled over to the corner, curled up to face the wall, and went perfectly still. Cole looked over at Clara, his eyes looking a little wet. He blinked and turned his head away, and Clara pretended she did not see it. Some hurts are too private for other folks to be watching. "I do not know how to do this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Nobody does. You just learn as you go. I was a terrible father back when I had the chance to be one. My boy, Daniel, I was never around. Always working, just always working. Chasing outlaws all over the territory while my own son was growing up without me. My wife, Miriam, she told me 100 times. She told me I was choosing that badge over my own family. And she was right. After a while, she just got tired of waiting." Clara handed him a clean cloth for his hand. "What happened?" "She left, took Daniel and went back east. He was 7 then. He is 10 now, if he is still." Cole had to stop. He swallowed hard, then started up again. "I have not laid eyes on him in 3 years. I do not have a clue where they are. Miriam made it plenty clear she did not want me to find them." "Is that when you started drinking so heavy?" "Oh, I was drinking before that. That is part of why she left. But after she was gone, I guess I stopped pretending there was any reason to quit." Clara wrapped the cloth around his hand, tying it off nice and neat. She could feel the shaking in his fingers, that little constant tremor a man gets when his body is trying to remember how to work without the poison. "My husband drank too," she said. And then, because the raw honesty in this man seemed to demand some in return, she added, "among other things." She did not say anything more, not just yet. Some doors you have to open just an inch at a time. That evening, long after Cole had gone back to his shed and the girl had settled into her nest on the floor with the dog and the bread knife and that crumpled piece of paper, Clara sat by herself in the dark kitchen. She sat in the chair right across from Henry's chair, the empty one, the one she just could not make herself move. She opened the cabinet over the stove, took down the bottle of laudanum, and measured out a very careful dose. Not too much, just enough to soften all the sharp edges, just enough to make the silence in the house bearable. She drank it down and waited for the world to get a little blurry, and when it did, she put her head down on the table and she cried. It was a quiet, controlled kind of crying. It seemed even her grief was something she had to manage. The next morning felt better, or at least it felt different. When Clara walked into the kitchen, the girl was already sitting there. She was not hiding in the corner this time, but was over by the stove where a little fire was going. The girl had apparently figured out how to add more kindling from the box by the door, because the flames were burning bright and the room was getting warm. The dog sat right next to her, licking clean a bowl that had held the leftover beans from last night. "Did you feed the dog?" Clara asked. The girl just looked at her, said nothing. "Well, thank you for starting the fire." Still, not a word. But the girl's eyes darted over to the stove and then back to Clara, and there was a flicker of something in her face that might have been pride. It was a tiny thing, just a little crack in that wall she had built around herself. Cole came in and the three of them ate breakfast together, well, sort of together. Clara and Cole sat at the table while the girl stayed on the floor by the stove, with the dog acting as a go-between. The girl ate every last bite Clara put on her plate and then stared at it, like she was trying to wish more food into being. So Clara gave her another helping. The girl ate all of that too. Then, very carefully, watching Clara the whole time, she took a biscuit and slid it under the dog's side. She was not feeding the dog. She was hiding it, saving it for later. Clara did not say a thing. She just made a note in her mind to start leaving food out where the girl could find it, in the same places at the same times, until she did not feel the need to hide it anymore. After breakfast, Emmy did something that changed the whole game. At supper that evening, Clara served up some beans and cornbread. The girl was sitting in what was now her usual spot on the floor by the stove. Clara put the plate down where she could reach it and took a step back, just like she always did. The girl looked down at the plate. Then she looked up at Clara, and then with a slow, deliberate motion, she pushed the plate right off the edge of the stove shelf. It hit the floor with a loud clatter, sending beans and cornbread all over the wooden planks. The girl just stared at Clara. Her eyes were not full of fear. They were hard and bright, like she was issuing a challenge, a dare. It was a test, and Clara could read it plain as day. If I am bad, are you going to send me away? If I break your things, are you going to hit me? If I ruin the food you give me, are you going to stop giving it? Every bone in Clara's body wanted to snap. She was worn down to a nub. She had not slept more than 3 hours in the last 2 days. The headache from the laudanum was pounding behind her eyes, and she had a kitchen to clean and a whole life to keep from falling apart. And now a 7-year-old girl had just thrown a perfectly good meal on the floor, a meal Clara could barely even afford to make. She picked up the plate. She wiped up the mess. She walked back to the stove, made a whole new plate of beans and cornbread, and set it down in the exact same spot as the first one. She did not say a single word. The girl looked at the new plate. Then she looked at Clara. Something in those old, weary eyes shifted. It was not trust. Not yet. But it was the start of the idea of trust. A door cracked open just the width of a fingernail. Emmy did not eat that second plate of food, but she did not push it away either. That evening, the little girl took a piece of charcoal from the stove and started drawing on the kitchen floor. Clara and Cole both watched her, not saying a word, hardly even daring to breathe. The girl drew with a focus and a skill that was surprising for a child her age. Lines started to appear on the pale wood floor. It was a house, not a simple kid's drawing with squares and triangles, but a real house, with a porch and windows and a fence all around it. There was a person standing by the door, a tall man wearing what looked to be a wide-brimmed hat. And right next to the house, she had printed a single letter in a shaky, careful hand. K. Clara looked over at Cole. But Cole was not looking at the letter. He was looking at the windows on the house. She had drawn every single one of them with small, straight lines going up and down, all evenly spaced. Bars. The windows had bars on them. Cole carried that picture in his head when he went out to the shed that night. A house with bars on all the windows. A man standing guard outside. The letter K. He pulled the cork from his flask, lifted it to his lips, and then poured every last drop out onto the dirt floor. Whatever was coming his way, he was going to have to be sober for it. Lord help him. The first piece of gossip reached Clara before she even had breakfast made. Cole Brennan was nothing but a drunk, a disgrace, and a man who had killed someone in cold blood. By lunchtime, another rumor had made its way to her. Judge Keene himself was taking a special interest in the child they had found. Clara heard the first story from Martha Greer's sister, who had stopped by to pay for a delivery. The woman stood there on Clara's porch, craning her neck to look past her into the house, trying to get a peek at the strange little girl everyone was whispering about. They're saying he shot a man down in San Antonio. Said he was drunk when he did it. That's why the Rangers kicked him out. People say a lot of things, Clara told her. I'm just telling you what I heard is all. A woman living all by herself ought to be careful who she lets get close. Clara thanked her for the money, closed the door, and for a long moment she just stood there with her forehead pressed against the cool wood, just breathing. Then she went to Gideon Hale's general store to buy some flour and salt, and whatever else she could afford with the little money she had left. Gideon was a tall, skinny man, thin as a fence rail, with a face that looked like it had been carved out by 62 years of the hot Texas sun and a decade of lost faith. He used to be a preacher way back before the Comanche raids and the border wars, and all the slow, grinding violence had turned his belief into dust. He still quoted scripture sometimes, the way a man might keep wearing a wedding ring from a marriage that ended years ago. It was just a habit, not a conviction. Clara, he said the moment she walked in. His voice was low and careful. We need to have a talk. About what? Judge Keene stopped by this morning, Gideon said, his voice low. He was asking about the girl. Said the court had a duty to see that abandoned children are taken care of right. Mentioned he had good families back east just waiting to adopt. Gideon's hands fidgeted on the counter, fussing with cans that were already straight as a pin. "And what did you say?" Clara asked. "I've known Solomon Keene for 15 years, he went on. I watched him build that guardianship program of his from scratch. I've seen parents sign their own children over to him with tears in their eyes, just thankful someone was offering those kids a better life." "But," she prompted. "But in 4 years, it's been 32 children, Clara, 32 that I can count, and I've not heard a single word from any of them, not one letter, not a postcard. Keene says they go east to good homes and good chances, but it's like they just vanish off the face of the earth." Clara placed her basket on the worn wooden counter. "What are you trying to tell me, Gideon?" "I'm telling you I've had a bad feeling about this for 2 years, and I don't like a single answer I've come up with. I'm telling you that little girl you've got might be tangled up in it, and I'm telling you to be careful. The judge ain't a man who takes kindly to questions." Clara paid for her flour and salt and started for home under a sky bleached out to the color of old sun-baked bone. The heat was a suffocating thing, pressing down on Bitter Creek like a heavy hand. Even the tough mesquite trees looked whipped, their leaves curled up tight, holding on to whatever moisture they had left. She was about 100 yards from her porch when she spotted the horse tied to the fence post. It wasn't Cole's rangy gelding. This was a fine animal, shiny and well-fed, with a saddle that cost more than her whole homestead. She knew that horse. It belonged to Judge Solomon Keene. A cold dread settled in Clara's stomach. She walked to her front door, pushed it open, and found the judge sitting in her kitchen. He was in Henry's chair, sipping coffee from one of her mugs. He rose the second she stepped inside. Always the proper gentleman, always looking sharp and respectable. He was a handsome man, the way power can make a man seem handsome, tall with silver hair and a face that just radiated authority and trust. He wore a dark suit, even in this heat, and his boots were shined so bright you could see your face in them. "Clara," he said, his voice as warm as a summer evening, "I surely hope you don't mind. Your door was open, so I made myself at home. I brought you a pie." He nodded toward the table where a perfect golden brown pie sat wrapped in a cloth. "It's my wife's recipe. Peach." "Judge Keene, what brings you all the way out here?" "Why, the child, of course. I understand you've taken her in, which is a real Christian thing to do. But you have to understand, as the county judge, I'm legally bound to make sure any abandoned child in my district gets the proper care." He gave a kind smile. "I know some excellent families back east who are happy to take in children with, well, with her kind of special needs. I could have her placed somewhere safe inside of a week." His voice was so smooth, his words sounded so sensible. His concern felt so real. Clara could feel herself being charmed, just like always. The judge had a true gift for it, this show of being a good man. He'd spoken at Henry's funeral with words so gentle they'd nearly shattered her. He'd signed the deed to her land with a comforting pat on her hand and a promise to look out for her. He had been her rock when she felt like she was falling to pieces. And now here he was, sitting in her dead husband's chair, offering to take this child off her hands with that same easy confidence. "So, where's the little one now?" Keene asked. "She's in the back room. May I see her?" Clara paused. A deep instinct inside her was screaming a warning, a feeling she couldn't put into words. But this was Judge Keene, the most respected man in the whole county. The man who held the power to approve her getting Henry's ranch back. She couldn't rightly refuse him without a good reason. Of course. She led the judge to the little spare room. The girl was sitting on the floor in her usual corner with the dog. She could hear Cole make a noise out in the barn. When the door swung open, the girl looked up at Clara, and her face was a blank slate. Then her eyes landed on Judge Keene. The change was like lightning striking. The little girl's entire body went stiff as a board. Her eyes locked on Keene's face with a look that was more than just fear. It was the dead-still terror of a rabbit that sees the same hawk that has hunted it before. This was not a stranger. This was a monster she knew. The dog, Dust, felt it too. He'd been dozing in the girl's lap, but he shot to his feet, facing Keen. His lips peeled back from his teeth. The fur on his back stood straight up, and a growl rumbled up from deep in his chest, a sound Clara had never heard from him. It wasn't the warning he gave to folks he didn't know. This was something else entirely. This was pure, bottomless hatred. The girl threw her arms around the dog, pulling him tight and burying her face in his fur. She started to shake, a silent, violent trembling that shook her whole small frame. Keen just looked at the girl, and Clara, watching his face, saw something flicker across it that had nothing to do with kindness or concern. It was gone in a flash, but she saw it plain as day. It was calculation. The cold, quick look of a gambler figuring out new odds. "Poor child," Keen said, his voice smooth as silk again. "She's clearly suffered a great trauma. That's all the more reason to get her to professionals who can help her right away." He left not long after that, taking his hat, his fine manners, and his peach pie with him. Clara stood on her porch and watched him ride off, feeling like the solid ground beneath her was starting to crack. Cole walked up from around the side of the house. "Did you see her eyes?" he asked. She knew him. "I saw it," Clara breathed. "That wasn't being scared of a stranger," Cole said. "She knows that man." A part of Clara wanted to argue. She wanted to find some other reason, one that would let her keep believing Judge Keen was the good man who helped her when Henry died. The man who held the key to her future. The man who stood for law and order in a place that didn't have much of either. But she couldn't erase what she'd just witnessed. The girl's raw terror. The dog's pure rage. And the look in Keen's eyes, as cold and clinical as a man taking stock of his property. That night, Clara lay in her bed. But sleep wouldn't come. The girl was in the other room with Dust. Cole was out in the shed. The house was quiet, except for the lonely sound of the wind and the far-off yapping of coyotes. She was floating in that hazy place, not quite awake and not quite asleep, when the dog started growling. It was a low, steady growl. The kind that meant something was wrong. Clara sat straight up in bed. The sound was coming from the back of the house near the kitchen. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, crept to the window, and peered out. There was a figure at her back door. A man working at the latch with slow, careful hands. He wasn't rattling it or trying to break it down. He was working it gentle-like, the way someone does when they mean to get in without making a sound. Before Clara could even breathe, another shape shot out from the dark of the shed. It was Cole. He covered the distance to the house in 3 long, silent steps and grabbed the man from behind. They wrestled in the dirt. Clara pressed her face against the window pane, her heart pounding against her ribs, watching the 2 men struggle in the moonlight. The whole thing was over in seconds, vicious, quiet, and brutal. The intruder had a knife. Clara saw the moonlight catch the blade once, saw Cole flinch as it sliced his arm, then saw him twist the man's wrist hard until the knife clattered to the ground. The next thing she knew, Cole had the man slammed up against the side of the house, his revolver pressed into him. She couldn't make out the words they exchanged, but after a minute, Cole stepped back, and the man scrambled away into the night, running hard and not looking back. Cole just stood there, catching his breath, one hand clamped on his forearm where blood was already soaking his shirt sleeve. Clara hurried to unbolt the back door. "Are you all right?" "It's just a scratch," Cole said. "Who was that?" "Well, you're the one that got a hold of him," she replied. Cole stepped into the lamplight. She could see the cut on his arm now, a clean slice across the muscle, bleeding steady but not looking too deep. She got her medicine box, sat him at the table, and started to clean the wound. "He was sent," Cole said, his voice tight. "He told me the judge wants the girl, said he gets paid to bring her in, not to ask any questions." Clara's hands didn't falter. They couldn't. A woman whose hands brought babies into this world, cleaned up folks' injuries, and held her own husband as he passed, couldn't afford to have them shake. But on the inside, she was trembling like a leaf. "So Keen's not even going to bother with the law," she said, more a statement than a question. "No. He sent a man to steal her, right out of my house, in the dead of night." Yes, ma'am. Clara finished wrapping the bandage around his arm. Her fingers grazed his skin, and she could feel the slight tremor in his muscles, that constant, fine shaking from the liquor he was fighting. She thought about how this man had just fought in the dark, with hands that sometimes struggled to hold a coffee cup still. He fought and he won, because when the choice was between his own weakness and a sleeping child, there really wasn't any choice at all. "Who are you, really, Cole Brennan?" she asked quietly. "I'm nobody special," he said. "Just a drunk the Rangers kicked to the curb for killing a man. Tell me the truth." He was silent for a long moment, staring at the bandage on his arm. Then he finally spoke. "The man I killed," he said, "was holding a knife to a little girl's throat. She was about the same age as the one sleeping in your other room. I was drunk. I had no business being there, no business holding a gun, no business doing anything but sleeping it off in a ditch somewhere, but I was there and he had that knife on her and I shot him." He let out a long breath. "The Board of Inquiry called it excessive force. Said the situation didn't call for a killing. Said my judgment was clouded by the drink. And they were right about that last part. But that little girl is alive today because I pulled that trigger. And the Rangers threw you out for it. They threw me out for being a drunk who shot a man. The rest of it was just details nobody cared to hear." Clara finished tying the knot on the bandage. "You're shaking," she said softly. "I know. What do you say? When's the last time you had a taste?" "Been 4 days now. You know it's going to get a whole lot meaner before it gets right. I'm counting on it." Clara leaned back, studying him in the yellow lamplight. She saw a man with hands crisscrossed with old scars and a tremor that would not quit. His eyes had stared deep into the pit and found nothing down there worth coming back up for. But that was before. Before he stumbled upon a little girl on a dusty road 4 days ago and something inside him finally shifted. That little girl. She knew who Keene was, Clara said, her voice low. She surely did. And that means Keene knows exactly who she is, knows where she belongs. Yep. And he already sent someone to drag her back. That's right. Clara got up and walked to the window, staring out into the pitch-black night. "Rosa told me something yesterday about that guardianship program of Keene's. 32 children sent off in 4 years. Not a single letter sent back home. No word from any family back east saying they arrived safe. 32 children, Cole. Where in God's name are they?" The question just hung there in the quiet, heavy as smoke from a damp fire. Neither one had the words. But deep down, they both knew the answer was something awful. That evening, Rosa had pulled Clara aside down at the general store. "I've been asking around about those placements Keene made. 32 little ones in 4 years, Clara. 32. And not one family back east ever wrote a letter to say the child got there." Rosa's voice got real quiet. "Where did those children go?" Emmy was drawing again. It was not a house this time, but a map. Just rough, shaky lines scraped into the packed dirt floor of Clara's kitchen. But Cole had seen maps drawn in worse places, sketched in blood and mud during the Red River campaigns, and he could read this one just fine. She was showing him the place she had come from. Cole hunkered down on the floor opposite her, watching the mark she made with a piece of charcoal. The girl worked like her life depended on it. Her little tongue stuck between her teeth and her brow all wrinkled up. The dog lay right beside her, chin on his paws. His big brown eyes fixed on Cole like he was saying, "You better watch this. This is important." The map showed a road, a long scratch running north to south with another trail branching off to the east. Where that trail ended, she drew a box, a building. Then she added more boxes, smaller ones all around the big one. And then came the fence. She drew it slow and careful, a line all the way around the buildings with sharp, upright slashes at the corners. Posts, could be guard posts. Then she drew that K again, bigger this time, smack in the middle of it all. Cole pointed a finger at the main road on her dirt map. "Is this the road where I found you?" The girl lifted her eyes to his. She did not nod. She did not shake her head no. But she laid one small finger on the far end of the road, the part heading north, and just looked at Cole in a way that left no doubt. "And this place," Cole said softly, pointing to the cluster of boxes. "Is this where you were, before I found you out on that road?" Her finger did not move from the map. Her eyes stayed locked on his. She squeezed her lips together so tight they turned white. "It's all right," Cole told her. "You do not have to say a word. Just show me." And she did. She drew little people inside the main building. Tiny stick figures with arms and legs. She drew 6 of them. Then she scratched heavy bars over the door, just like the ones she had drawn on the windows before. Then she drew one last figure, way outside the fence, all by itself, walking away from that place. It was her. Cole sat back on his heels, the pieces clicking into place. His mind went to work the way it did back in his ranger days, fitting together scraps of information, reading the scene, building the whole ugly picture. This girl had not been abandoned by some poor family. She had come from inside a system. From inside Judge Keene's system. She was one of those children who was supposed to be back east, only none of them ever went east. They were taken to a place, a ranch, a compound, whatever this map was showing him. A place with high fences and barred windows and guards on the corners. And somehow, she got out. That twisted foot of hers had been her cage, but it had also been her key. It made her look slow, helpless. It made the guards write her off as no kind of threat. But she had walked, for a whole day and a whole night, just one awful step after another, dragging that foot through the dust and the brush and the long, empty miles, until she was so far away they figured she could not have gotten anywhere at all, except they had not quit looking for her. Those wagon tracks proved it. Somebody had come back to that road expecting to find her, and when they did not, they moved on. And not long after, Judge Keene himself showed up at Clara's door with a fresh-baked pie and a friendly smile. Cole told Clara the whole story. They sat out on the porch that night after the girl was fast asleep, talking in quiet voices as the stars popped out one by one. A wind was kicking up from the south, carrying the smell of dust and that sharp metal tang that meant a big storm was brewing somewhere out on the plains. He told her about the map, about the buildings, the bars, the fence, and that one little stick figure walking away. And he told her what he had seen when he went into Gideon's store that afternoon. There was a notice tacked to the board, he said. It was not for a missing child. It was something they call a runaway ward. That is the legal way of saying a kid under the court's care has taken off. The description fit her perfectly. Her age, the clubfoot, the fact she does not speak. It was signed by Judge Solomon Keene. Offered a $20 reward. $20, Clara said, her voice flat as a tabletop. I would bet my last cent that is more than double what was paid to get her in the first place. Clara did not say anything for a long while. The wind rustled through the mesquite trees, making them whisper to each other. Inside the little house, the dog grumbled in his sleep and resettled. If Keene is doing what we think he is doing, Clara finally said, then I have been living safe and sound under the wing of a monster for 2 years. He is the one who signed Henry's death certificate. He is the one who approved my papers for this ranch. He held my hand at the graveside and told me it was all part of God's great plan. Her voice was like steel, but her hands were shaking. And all that time he was smiling and helping me, he was selling children. You could not have known. I should have. 32 children. It was all happening right under my nose, and I did not see a thing. Because I did not want to see it. Because I needed him to like me. Because I needed his name on my ranch papers. She turned her head to look right at him. In the faint starlight, her face was all sharp angles and deep shadows, beautiful and tough and full of resolve. If I go up against Keene, she said, I will lose this ranch. He is the one who signs off on all the land deeds. Every last dime I have saved for 2 years, every payment I have scraped together for the bank, it all turns to dust without his signature. I know. This ranch, it is the only thing I have left of my life with Henry. It is the last thing that proves any of that was ever real. I know that. But there are little ones locked up behind bars because I have been too busy chasing the ghost of a dead man to pay attention to what was happening right here in my own town. Cole stayed quiet. This was her decision to make, not his. He could not make it for her. Clara looked up at the endless field of stars. Then she looked toward the house, where that little girl was sleeping with her dog and her scrap of paper and that old bread knife. "You tell me what you need me to do," she said. Later that night, Cole told her the rest of it. About the Rangers, about the bottle, about Miriam and Daniel. He just laid the facts out, plain and simple like a field report, with no feeling and no asking for pity. He told her because she had a right to know the kind of man she was throwing in with. Because if this all went sideways, she needed to know exactly who was standing next to her. "I am about the worst man you could pick to protect somebody," he told her straight. "But right at this moment, I am the only man here." Clara did not offer him any soft words. Instead, she said, "My Henry, he figured he was the worst man alive, too. And he was right, but not for the reasons he thought. He was the worst because he just plain quit." She looked Cole square in the eye. "You fixin' to quit?" "No." "Well, that settles it, then." But Cole couldn't keep his word for more than a few hours. That was just the way Cole Brennan was built. He had a knack for breaking things. The very next morning, he informed Emmy he'd be gone for just 2 hours. He planned to ride down the southern road, following the path on her map to scout for those buildings and find some kind of proof. 2 hours, he promised. He even held up a pair of fingers and looked her straight in the eye. Just 2 hours. He was gone for 10. That southern road was a lot more trouble than he anticipated. He came across fresh tracks, a wagon and horses that led him into some real rough country that was a chore to get through. The ranger in him took over. That part of him that just couldn't let a trail go cold once he was on it, and he followed them much farther than he should have. By the time he decided to head back, the sun was already past its peak, casting long shadows across the land, and he was a hard 2-hour ride from Bitter Creek. When he finally rode in, Clara was waiting on the porch, her arms folded and a look that could kill in her eyes. "She's underneath the bed," Clara said, her voice like ice. "She's been cowering under there for 6 solid hours. She won't come out. She won't take food, she won't take water. The dog is under there with her, and he starts growling if I even get close. I just lost track of the time." "You lost track of the time." Clara's voice didn't get louder. It got quieter, and that was a whole lot worse. "That little girl hides food under her pillow because she's certain she won't get another meal. She swiped a knife because she thinks she has to fight for her life while she's asleep. And you promised her 2 hours and then vanished for 10. You just confirmed every awful thing she already believes about people." Each word landed on Cole like a punch to the gut because every last one of them was true. He made his way to the spare room. Emmy was under the bed, wedged tight against the far wall. The dog was right there with her, and both of them were staring at the doorway. Her eyes were completely dry. She was beyond tears now, in a much worse place. It was a complete emptiness, a retreat deep inside herself where nobody could get to her. Cole looked at the little girl and saw the whole sorry pattern of his life laid out right in front of him. The mission always had to come first. It was always about the mission. Track down the outlaw, stay on the trail, just ride 1 more mile, 1 more hour, 1 more day. And the folks who depended on him, the ones who were waiting for him to come home, they eventually figured out it was best to stop waiting. Miriam had figured it out. Daniel had figured it out. And right now, Emmy was learning that very same lesson. He didn't even try to coax her out. He just sat down on the floor right outside her bedroom door, leaned his back against the wall, and started talking. He wasn't talking to Emmy, though. He was talking to the dog. "I really messed up," he said. I told her 2 hours and then I stayed out all day long. That was just plain wrong of me. I'm not going to sit here and promise it won't happen again because I know folks have told you that before and they were lying. But I'm sitting right here now. And I'll still be sitting right here when the sun comes up. And he stayed put. Clara brought him a glass of water and he drank it. She brought him a blanket and he draped it over his shoulders. The floor was hard and cold. His back started to ache, and the spot on his arm where the knife had sliced him began to throb. His hands started to shake with the deep-down tremors of going dry. But he stayed. The hours crept by. The house grew dark. Clara's lamp went out. The wind howled against the sides of the house. Somewhere out in the hills, coyotes began to call. Cole just sat on that floor and waited. When Clara came to check at dawn, Cole was fast asleep, sitting up, his head resting against the wall, the blanket having slipped off one shoulder. And the little girl had moved. She wasn't under the bed anymore. She was lying on the floor just on the other side of the doorway, curled up with the dog. One of her small hands was stretched out through the space under the door. It wasn't touching Cole. Not quite. But it was close enough for her to know he was still there. Later that night in the shed, Cole loaded his revolver. 6 rounds. He had another 12 in his saddlebag. 18 bullets to stand between Emmy and whatever was headed their way. It didn't feel like enough. It never did. But then he remembered he'd started the week with just a horse and a bad hangover. And now he had something much worse. He had something to lose. Emmy said her first word on a Tuesday. It wasn't help or please or even no. It was Dust, the name of the dog, whispered into his matted fur when she was sure no one could hear her. Clara heard it from the kitchen and had to press a hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. It just came out of nowhere. The girl was sitting in her usual corner with the dog, just running her fingers through his coat like she did every single morning. It was a little ritual of touch that seemed to be the only thing that kept her connected to the world. Clara was over at the stove, heating up water for coffee with her back to them, a presence that was known but not intimidating. And into the calm of that perfectly normal morning, a voice appeared. It was small, hoarse from not being used. It was hardly louder than a breath. Dust. Clara went completely still. She didn't dare turn around. She didn't make a single move. She just stood there at the stove, stirring the water and blinking hard until the stinging in her eyes went away. She knew, with the kind of gut feeling a woman gets after a lifetime of mending broken things, that this moment wasn't for her. It was something that belonged only to the girl and the dog, and to whatever delicate connection was being formed between silence and speaking. The girl said his name again. Dust. And in response, the dog's tail gave a single thump against the wooden floor. Clara poured the coffee, carried a cup to the table, and sat down to drink it as if it were any other day. As if the entire world hadn't just tilted on its foundation. As if a 7-year-old girl who hadn't said a single word in who knows how long had just whispered a name into a dog's ear and changed the course of everything. Getting better wasn't a straight path. Clara discovered this over the following days with a level of patience she never knew she had in her. On some mornings, the girl would make little noises like a hum while the dog was eating, or a soft sigh when a sunbeam hit the floor, and almost a giggle when Dust started chasing his tail out in the yard. But on other mornings, she would pull back into her corner with her silence and her bread knife, and she wouldn't emerge until the light outside shifted, and some kind of clock inside her told her it was safe to come out again. Cole was learning some things, too. He'd gotten into the habit of sitting on the corral fence in the mornings, working with Maverick and talking to the horse in a low, steady voice that drifted across the yard to where the girl would sit on the porch with the dog. The girl would watch him with those old, knowing eyes, following his every move and studying how he handled the big horse. One morning, Cole lifted her up and set her on the fence rail right next to him. She grabbed onto the wood with both hands, her small, twisted foot just dangling, her face strained from the effort of keeping her balance. Maverick stood right below them, turning his massive head to look at the tiny person perched above him. "A horse doesn't care one bit what you look like or how you get around," Cole said. He wasn't looking at the girl. His eyes were on the horse. He only cares if you're honest with him. If you're quiet and you're patient, he'll give you his trust. That's all a horse ever asks for, honesty and patience. Folks could stand to learn a thing or two from horses. He was talking to Maverick, and he was talking to Emmy. And maybe, just maybe, he was talking to himself. The girl just watched the horse. Maverick flicked his ears and snorted, blowing air from his nostrils, but he stood perfectly still, as patient as the ground itself. After a good long while, the girl reached down with one hand, ever so slowly, ever so carefully. She touched the horse's nose. Maverick didn't even twitch. The girl's fingers slowly spread out against the warm, velvety feel of his muzzle, and she just held them there, feeling the rhythm of his breathing. As Cole set her on the ground beside the fence, her hand came to rest on his arm. It was not a grip, nor did she cling to him. It was just a touch. Her palm settled over the inside of his forearm, directly on the bandage covering his knife wound. The moment lasted no more than 2 seconds. Then she pulled her hand back and scurried to the porch where the dog waited. Just 2 seconds. A feeling as light as a sparrow's wing. Yet Cole remained by the fence for a good while after, staring at the spot on his arm where she had touched him, certain that if he tried to speak, no words would come out. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Sheriff Wade Hobbs came riding up to Clara's house. Clara was inside, busy making poultices for a rancher's wife who'd laid her hand on a hot cook stove. Cole was out in the barn. The little girl and the dog were in the spare room. Wade was a large man getting soft around the middle, with a face that was once gentle but was now sliding into jowls. He wore his star like a man so used to its presence he no longer felt the weight of it. He swung down from his horse, walked to the door, and took off his hat, holding it with both hands in front of his chest. Clara recognized this gesture. It was his way of acting humble when he was after something. "Clara," he began, "you have a moment?" "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" "Do you mind if I step inside?" She certainly did mind. But she moved aside to let him into her kitchen, not offering him a seat or a cup of coffee. Wade's gaze swept the room, pausing for a moment on the door to the spare room. "Look," he said, "I'm going to be plain with you. Folks are talking. About the drifter you have got sleeping in your shed, about the girl, about what in the world is going on in this house. What is going on here is that I am giving medical help to a child who is left for dead on the road. And what about the drifter? Mr. Brennan is the one who found her and carried her here. He is staying on to see that she stays safe." Wade nervously turned his hat over and over in his hands. "The thing is, Clara, I ran a check on your Mr. Brennan. He is a former ranger, got kicked out for killing a man while he was drunk. That is not the sort of fellow a respectable widow ought to be keeping around." "Are you getting to the point of this visit, Sheriff?" Wade's eyes locked with hers. Something in them shifted. The friendly act vanished like rainwater in a dry gulch, and something harder took its place, colder. The look of a man who had come to settle a debt. "Clara, you know I hold you in high regard. This whole town does. But people are starting to wonder. They are asking why you have a drifter with a criminal past bunking in your shed. And, well, you know how it is. Sometimes new questions stir up old ones nobody wants to think about again." He let the silence hang in the air. "About Henry. About what really happened the day he died." The breath caught in Clara's throat. She stood there, frozen, her hands limp at her sides, feeling as if the floorboards were about to give way beneath her. "What are you trying to say?" Her voice was unwavering, but her heart was pounding. "I am saying that Judge Keene is concerned for the child. He has a duty under the law to look out for her welfare. He is hoping you will see reason and cooperate. Make this whole thing easy on everybody." Wade settled his hat back on his head. "Because if things get difficult, Clara, well, difficult has a way of drawing attention. And attention has a way of flipping over rocks that most folks would just as soon leave alone." He turned and left without saying anything else. Clara stood motionless in her kitchen, listening to the sound of his horse's hooves grow faint down the road, feeling the very foundation of the life she had built so carefully begin to crack. He was aware, or perhaps Keene was. One of them had uncovered the truth about Henry, or had known all along, and they kept that knowledge tucked away like a loaded gun, ready to be used when the time was right. And that time was now. The choice was simple: cooperate or be ruined. Surrender the girl or lose it all. Her secret, her good name, the ranch, the entire delicate structure of her existence. That evening, Clara sat alone in her dark kitchen and drank laudanum. She drank more than she usually did, more than she needed. She drank until the sharp corners of the world softened, and the deep pain in her chest became a dull, tolerable throb, and the memory of Henry's gunshot finally faded from her mind. She was at the table, the empty bottle beside her and tear tracks on her face, when Cole rapped on the back door. She answered it without a second thought, not caring about her appearance, not trying to manage or control or put on a brave face. She simply opened the door. Cole's eyes took in her face, then the bottle on the table, and then returned to her face. "Are you okay?" he asked. And for the first time in 2 years, Clara gave a truthful answer. "No, I am not okay." He stepped inside. He did not scold her. He did not pass judgment. He just took a seat at the table across from her, folded his hands, and waited. And so, Clara told him everything. She told him about Wade's visit, about the threat, about the leverage Keene was using to control her. She did not tell him the details about Henry. Not yet. But she told him what mattered. "They know something from my past that could destroy me," she explained. "And they will use it if I refuse to give them the girl." "What is it you want to do?" "I want to empty this bottle on the ground and swear off it forever. And I want to tell Judge Keene to go straight to hell." Cole sat in silence for a moment. Then he reached inside his coat and pulled out his own flask. He raised it so the lamplight caught the glass. It was half full of whiskey, the same whiskey that had been tempting him for days, promising to ease the tremors and the sweats and the ache that went clear to his bones. He got to his feet, walked to the back door, and pushed it open. Clara watched his every move. He tipped the flask and poured the whiskey onto the dirt. The liquid created a dark, wet circle in the dust, which spread for a moment before sinking into the ground and disappearing. He returned to the table and placed the empty flask down. Clara stared at his flask. Then she looked at her own bottle. She picked it up, went to the back door, and poured the laudanum out onto the dirt, right next to the spot where his whiskey had soaked in. 2 dark patches side by side, absorbed by the Texas soil. They stood together in the darkness, gazing at the damp ground, and neither of them spoke of what had just happened. He had surrendered his flask. She had surrendered her bottle. Standing there in the night with the empty containers at their feet, they both knew. They were making a choice to feel it all from now on. The fear, the rage, and the tender, impossible feeling that was growing between them, with nothing to numb the pain. That very same evening, in a fine house on the better side of Bitter Creek, Judge Solomon Keene was sitting down to supper with his family. His daughter had prepared a roast beef. His granddaughter, a bright and healthy 7-year-old full of life, ran to embrace him the moment he walked in. "Grandpa, the barn cat had her kittens. There are 4 of them." "Elves, can I have one? Please?" Keene scooped her into his arms, held her close, and kissed her on the forehead. "We shall see," he replied, which was his usual way of saying yes. His wife was setting the table. His daughter poured him a cup of coffee. His granddaughter chattered on about the kittens, about her day at school, and about a new dress her mother was making for her. Keene listened with a smile, ate his dinner, and for that single hour, he was a good man, a grandfather, a respected member of the community. Then, looking over his granddaughter's head, his gaze drifted out the window toward the South Road. For just an instant, a thought crossed his mind. If his own granddaughter ever fell into the clutches of a man like him, what would he do? The thought vanished as quickly as it came. He dismissed it. He had dismissed it countless times before. It became easier every time. That was the most terrible part of it all. Cole had not organized a raid since his time with the Rangers, and in those days he had 20 men, the backing of the federal government, and the firm belief that he was on the right side of the law. Now all he had was a store clerk, a saloon owner, a midwife, and absolutely no authority at all. It was going to have to be enough. They met at Rosa Delgado's saloon after she had closed for the night, the four of them seated around a table in the back room where Rosa did her bookkeeping and kept her business private. Rosa had locked the doors, drawn the shades, and put a bottle of mezcal on the table that no one had touched. "This is what I have found out," Rosa began. She smoothed out a hand-drawn map on the table, a map she had pieced together from bits of conversation with freight haulers, ranch hands, and the traveling salesmen who passed through Bitter Creek on their way to someplace better. "Keene has a property about 30 miles south of here, down in Comanche Canyon. It used to be a cattle ranch, but it failed about 5 years ago. He bought it for next to nothing. The official records list it as an agricultural property. But there has not been a single head of livestock registered to that place in 3 years. "So what is out there?" Gideon asked. "There are buildings, a bunkhouse, a main house, fences, and children." Rosa looked at each of them in turn. "I have been asking around for 2 weeks, very quietly, talking to people that Keene does not know I am connected to. I have had 2 different teamsters confirm they saw children on that property. They were not playing, they were working, hauling rocks, sorting things. Both of them said it seemed wrong, but neither one asked any questions. They did not want to know the answers." Cole went over the map again. It was a perfect match for the one Emmy had scratched into the dirt on Clara's floor. The road, the fork, the little group of buildings, and the fence. "When does Keene leave town?" Cole asked. "He's gone this weekend. Leaves on Friday for Austin. He claims it's court business, but my cousin down in Austin told me that Keene always meets with mining contractors when he's there, the kind of men who are always looking for cheap labor." Rosa's voice was completely flat. "He'll be gone for 3 days. There will be 2 guards at the ranch, 3 at the most." "I'm going in," Cole stated. "Not by yourself, you're not," Gideon said. The old man's jaw was set in a way that Cole knew all too well. It was pure stubbornness, the kind that didn't know how to back down. "Gideon, if this all goes sideways, if it goes sideways, I'd much rather be there getting it wrong alongside you than be right and safe at home in my bed. I've spent 10 years knowing something was wrong and doing absolutely nothing about it. I've had enough of that." Clara then spoke up. "I managed to borrow a camera from that photographer who came through here last week. He left it behind as payment for me nursing his fever. If you can get pictures of the children, of the conditions they're in, of the account books, that would be proof. Real, solid proof." Cole gave a firm nod. "We'll head out Friday night. We go in, we get out, we take pictures, we grab the ledgers, whatever we can get our hands on. We don't mess with the guards unless we absolutely have to. We're not going to try and free the children, not this time. If we spook Keene before we have enough evidence to bury him, he'll just move them and we might never find them again." "And what happens after that?" Gideon asked. "Model, after it is done, we will need to find someone with real authority. A U.S. Marshal, maybe a state prosecutor. Somebody that Keene cannot get his hands on." "I will take care of that," Rosa said. Everybody turned to look at her. She just shrugged her shoulders. "What? I write letters. I write a lot of letters. To a lot of people. In 3 different languages. Somebody is bound to listen." Friday dawned under a sickly yellow-gray sky. The clouds were stacking up high to the south, looking like the whole world was building up to a final reckoning. Cole threw a saddle on Maverick at midnight and rode over to Gideon's store. The old man was waiting for him with his big hunting rifle, a canteen, and a look on his face as hard as rock. "You certain about this?" Cole had to ask. "Son, I have been preaching scripture about justice for 30 years. It is about time I did something more than just talk about it." They rode south, and the land got meaner with every passing mile. The flat prairie fell away to limestone ridges. Scrubby cedar trees and dry creek beds that would be roaring rivers once that storm finally cut loose. Cole took the lead, reading the country just like he used to in his ranger days, checking landmarks against the map Rosa gave him, making changes for the dark and the strange ground. They made it to Comanche Canyon just as the moon was dipping below the horizon. The ranch was right there, just where the map said it would be. Cole reined Maverick in on a ridge looking down into the valley and took a long look at the place through the gloom. There was a main house, dark and silent. A long bunkhouse, just as dark, with little windows that threw back no light at all, which meant they were covered up, or barred. There was a smaller shack that was probably for storage, a corral with not a single horse in it, and a fence a good 8 feet high that circled the bunkhouse and the main house completely. 2 fellas were sitting by a fire near the front gate. Guards. They were passing a bottle back and forth and did not look like they were paying much mind to anything. Cole and Gideon tied up their horses in a thicket of cedar about 200 yards from that fence and went the rest of the way on foot. Cole's arm gave a dull ache where the knife cut was healing, and his hand still had that tremor, though it was better than it was a week ago. He figured the shaking would never go away completely. Some things just break for good. But he could hold a revolver steady enough. He could still climb a fence, and he could move through the dark without a sound. And for right now, that was going to have to be enough. They waited till the guard's campfire had burned down to glowing coals and both fellas were about to nod off. Cole scaled the fence while Gideon kept him covered from the outside, peering at the guards through the sights of his rifle. He went for the main house first. Cole found a window that was left unlocked, because who in their right mind would come all the way out here? Who would even think to try? He found himself in an office. There was a desk, a mess of papers, and a ledger book as thick as a Bible. He cracked open that ledger and his blood ran ice cold. It was full of names, columns and columns of names, all written in the same tidy handwriting as the list Emmy clutched in her hand. These were children's names, their ages, the dates they were taken, the money paid out, and where they were sent. It was not back east. Not a single one went back east. They were sent to silver mines in the New Mexico Territory, to cotton plantations in Louisiana, a brick factory in East Texas. Each child was listed with a price paid to their family, a price taken from the buyer, and the difference marked down in a column he labeled margin. Margin. That was the profit on a child's life, figured down to the last penny. Cole took pictures of every single page. Clara's camera was a clumsy, slow thing. Each picture forced him to stand perfectly still for seconds that stretched into hours. But he pushed through it, one page after another, his hands steadier than they had been in months. It turned out that pure anger was better than whiskey for curing the shakes. He found Emmy's name. Emma Donnelly, 7 years old, clubfoot, taken in March of 1882. $8 paid to her family. $15 received from the buyer. The margin was $7. She had been sold for a $7 profit. And then he saw the name that made his heart stop dead in his chest. Daniel Brennan, 10 years old, healthy. Taken in June of 1882. $25 paid, $40 received from the buyer. His destination was listed as Comanche Canyon, waiting for transfer. Cole just stared at the name. It was his son. His own boy's name, right there in this awful book of human beings treated like cattle, written down with the same cool detachment as every other child who had been bought and sold through that office. Daniel. He was supposed to be safe, back east with Miriam. He was supposed to be okay. But Miriam never went east. The truth hit Cole like a kick from a mule. She never made it. Maybe she ran out of money. Maybe she got married again. And somewhere along the line, through a series of bad luck and worse choices, Daniel had fallen into Keene's clutches. He'd been sold into the very same system that had taken Emmy and the 36 other children whose names filled that ledger. It all came back around. Every last bit of it led straight back to Cole's own decisions. If he had not been drinking, he would not have been kicked out of the service. If he had not been kicked out, Miriam would not have left him. If Miriam had not left, Daniel would never have ended up here. Every page in this ledger was a direct result of Cole Brennan's own failings. He nearly dropped the camera. His sight went blurry. His chest tightened up so bad he could not breathe, could not think. He could not do a thing but stare at his son's name and feel the whole crushing weight of 3 wrecked years come crashing down on him. A hand landed on his shoulder. It was Gideon. He had slipped inside when Cole did not show back up at the window. The old man looked down at the ledger, saw the name Cole was staring at, then looked at Cole's face. "Is that your boy?" Gideon whispered. Cole could not find the words. He just nodded. "Well then, we finish this, right here and now, and we are going to get him back." They heard a noise outside, boots crunching on the dirt. It was the third guard, the one Rosa mentioned might be around. Cole snapped the ledger shut, shoved it into the bag they brought, and the two of them slipped back out the window. The guard was about 30 feet off, walking toward the main house with a lantern swinging in his hand. Cole stepped right out of the shadows and hit him. It was not a fancy move, nothing from his ranger training. He just hit him, pouring all the rage and grief and fear from his fist straight into the man's jaw. The guard crumpled to the ground. But he was not knocked out. He had a knife. Cole felt it slice into his forearm again, the same arm reopening the same wound, hot blood pouring over his wrist. He wrenched the knife away, pinned the man down, and pushed the barrel of his revolver against the guard's chest. "How many children are in that bunkhouse?" The guard's eyes were wide with fear. 11. There are 11 of them. Is one of them named Daniel? I do not know any names. They just give us numbers. Numbers. Not children, just numbers. Cole tied the guard up with some rope from the corral, and they fell back. They went back over the fence, back to the horses, and melted back into the darkness of Comanche Canyon, carrying the ledger, the photographs, and the terrible knowledge that 11 children were trapped behind those walls, and Cole's son just might be one of them. They rode hard to the north. Cole was bleeding pretty bad. His arm was a mess, the wound torn open and angry, with blood soaking the sleeve of his shirt clean through. But he could not feel it. He could not feel anything but the fierce, awful, and wonderful weight of hope. His son might be alive. After 3 long years of believing Daniel was gone, of grieving for him like he was dead, his son might be alive in a building just 30 miles south of where they were. Gideon rode beside him, quiet as the night. He did not offer any words of comfort. He did not quote any scripture. He just rode, steady and solid, like an anchor in the middle of a storm. Cole did not tell Clara about Daniel, not just yet. One rescue at a time, one broken thing at a time. But that name was burned into the back of his mind like a cattle brand, and for the first time in 3 years, Cole Brennan did not want a drink. He wanted a war. Judge Keene showed up at Clara's door right at dawn, and he did not come by himself. Behind him stood Wade, and 4 men Clara had never laid eyes on before. They were hard-looking men with new rifles in their hands and old eyes in their heads. "Mrs. Abbott," Keene said with a pleasant smile, "I have a court order here for the child. I surely do hope we can handle this in a civilized manner." The sky behind them was the color of a fresh bruise. For days, yellowish-gray clouds had been building up, stacking on top of each other like boxcars on a railroad siding. The air was thick and heavy with that electric feeling you get right before a big Texas storm. The wind had been kicking up since midnight, hot and agitated, stirring up dust and the smell of ozone. Every dog in Bitter Creek was hiding under a porch. Every horse in its stall was on edge. The very land itself felt like a coiled snake, just waiting. Clara stood there in her doorway, still in the dress she had slept in. Her hair was not combed, but her eyes were clear and as hard as flint. She had not slept a wink. She did not need to. Sometime in those long hours between midnight and sunup, while she sat alone at her kitchen table without her medicine and without any comfort. She had made up her mind. And once she had, a calm settled over her. Cole was not there. He had not come back from the raid. Clara had no idea if he was alive or dead or sitting in a jail cell. She did not know if Gideon was with him or if something had gone terribly wrong. All she knew was that it was dawn. Judge Keene was on her porch, and she was all by herself. No, that was not right. She was not alone. Behind her in the spare room, Emmy sat on the floor with dust. She held the bread knife in one hand and the piece of paper in the other, listening to every single word through those thin walls. "Judge Keene," Clara said, "before you set foot in my house, there are a few things you ought to know. Clara, this does not have to be a difficult situation. No, it surely does not. So allow me to make it real simple for you." Clara stepped out onto the porch. Behind Keene, neighbors started appearing in their doorways and on their own porches, drawn out by the sight of the judge and his armed men standing at the midwife's house at the crack of dawn. Good. Clara wanted folks to see this. She needed them to. "I have sent some letters," Clara announced, raising her voice so that everyone on the street could hear her plain as day. "They were not sent to you. They are about me. They are about the fact that my husband, Henry Abbott, did not die in some riding accident. Henry shot himself. I found him in our barn with his own pistol right beside him, and I cleaned up the mess myself, and I have been lying to every soul in this town for 2 years. A dead silence fell over the street. It was the kind of quiet that happens when the world suddenly turns upside down, and everyone is scrambling to get their feet back under them. Wade's jaw dropped open. Keene's eyes narrowed to slits. "I sent that confession," Clara went on, "to 3 different newspapers and to the governor's office down in Austin. And along with it, I sent copies of some documents that lay out what has really been happening to the children in your guardianship program, Judge Keene." The first crack of thunder rumbled across the plains. It was a deep, long sound, like the whole earth was clearing its throat. You could see a whole series of thoughts flash across Keene's face, one right after the other. First surprise, then calculation, then recovery. He was good. You had to give him that. Even now, completely caught off guard, he was already adjusting, thinking, trying to find his way back to solid ground. "Clara, you are clearly distressed. The death of a husband, the strain of caring for a traumatized child. These things can take a heavy toll. I believe perhaps you need some rest. We can discuss all of this after you have had a moment to compose yourself." "I am perfectly composed, and I am not done talking. Mrs. Abbott, I have a court order. Wade." The sheriff took a step forward. He did not look too happy about it. His hand was resting on his gun belt, but his fingers were tapping nervously, and his eyes kept darting from Clara to the growing crowd of neighbors and back again. "Sheriff, you will execute the order," Keene demanded. Wade stalled. "Judge, maybe we ought to execute the order." Wade took one more step toward the door. And then from inside the house came a sound that stopped him in his tracks. Then a voice cut through the silence. It was tiny and rough, like a rusty hinge from never being used, but you knew what it was. It was a child's voice, speaking its very first word, and that word was a name. Keene. Emmy was standing there in the doorway. She leaned on the frame to hold herself up. Her hurt foot was twisted out at that awful angle. She held the bread knife in one hand while the dog huddled close to her legs. Her face was pale as a sheet and her eyes looked huge, but her voice, Lord, her voice was as steady as a rock. "Keene," she said one more time, and she lifted her other hand and pointed it right at the judge. "Keene, Keene, Keene." She kept saying it over and over. It was a chant, a judgment, a calling him out by name. She pointed at him with the fierce certainty of a little girl who had lost everything, and because of that, had nothing left to be scared of. Beside her, Dust started barking, adding his voice to hers. The sound of that 7-year-old girl and a scruffy dog filled the main street of Bitter Creek like a trumpet call. The crowd got bigger. More folks came out, drawn by the yelling and the barking, and the feeling that something was happening that had never happened before. They stepped out of their houses and their stores and the saloon, lining the street, just watching. For the first time Clara could ever remember, Keen lost his cool. The mask he always wore just slipped. "You quiet that child down," he snarled. The words came out filled with a poison that had nothing to do with being worried about a scared little girl. He sounded like a man talking about something that could destroy him, something he needed to shut up for good. The crowd heard it. Clara saw the look on their faces change, saw the understanding spread through them like a ripple in a pond. This was not a judge worried about a child. This was a man terrified of what that child was about to say. Thunder rumbled again, a whole lot closer this time. The first big drops of rain started to fall, hitting the dust and leaving dark spots on the pale ground, like fresh bruises. Then, at the far end of the street, Cole appeared. He did not come riding in like the cavalry. He was limping, leading Maverick by the reins. His left arm was wrapped in a bloody cloth, and his face was gray from being worn clean out. Gideon was right there with him, looking just as beat, carrying a saddlebag that sagged with the heavy weight of a ledger book and a camera. Cole did not even reach for his gun. He walked right by the crowd, right by the armed men, right by Keen. And he stopped right in front of Wade. He spoke in a low voice. Only Wade could hear him. "My son's name is written in that book. Daniel Brennan. He was 10 years old. If you choose to help this man today, I will not end you. I will make sure you stay alive long enough for every last person in this territory to know exactly what you did and what you failed to do." Wade looked at Cole. He looked at the ledger in Gideon's hands. He looked out at the crowd, at the rain that was starting to come down, and at the little girl in the doorway who was still pointing at the judge and saying his name in that small, chilling voice. Wade took a step back. He just moved aside. He did not pull his gun. He did not put up a fight. He did not say a word. He just stepped right off the porch, walked over to his horse, and stood there with his back to everyone, his head hanging low and his shoulders slumped, a coward to his very core. But at least in that single moment he was a coward who chose to do nothing instead of doing something much worse. Keen was all alone. His hired guns looked at each other, then at the crowd, and then at the sheriff who had just left them high and dry. The rain was falling harder now, making a drumming sound on the wooden walkway and cutting little rivers in the street. Keen's expensive suit was getting soaked. His silver hair was stuck to his forehead. His power, his confidence, his carefully built image of a respectable man, all of it was washing away in the rain like words on a page. "This is not finished," Keen said. "No," Cole agreed with him. "It is not. But for today, you are leaving." Keen looked straight at Emmy. The little girl stared right back. She had stopped saying his name. She just stood in the doorway with her knife and her dog and her silence, and she looked at him with eyes that saw him for what he truly was, and she was not afraid one bit. Keen turned and walked to his horse. He swung himself up into the saddle, his whole body stiff and tight. He rode away slow, right down the main street of Bitter Creek, through the pouring rain, past the faces of all the people who were watching, people who would never see him the same way again. He kept his back straight. He kept his pride. And that was the thing that scared Clara the most. A man who flies into a panic is easy to figure out. But a man who backs away with a plan is already thinking about his next attack. "It is not finished," Cole said, standing beside her, the rain running down his face. "No," Clara agreed. "But we did not lose today." Cole's hand found hers in the rain. She let him hold on to it. And Emmy, standing in the doorway with dust right beside her, watched them with eyes that were, for the first time, not old and tired. They were just young, just full of hope, just a child's eyes. The rain came down in sheets. The storm that had been threatening for days finally let loose over Bitter Creek. And it was a mean one, the way Texas storms always are, the way the truth is when it finally comes out. It pounded on the roofs and flooded the streets and washed every bit of dust away, leaving the whole town looking clean and raw and new. Inside Clara's house, Emmy sat on the floor with her dog. She let Clara put a warm blanket around her shoulders. She was trembling, but not from being scared. It was something else. It felt like the opposite of fear, but she did not have a name for it yet. She had used her voice. She had said his name. She had pointed a finger at the monster, and the monster had backed down. For 7 long years, being quiet had been her only defense. But today, she had found a new one. Her voice. A United States Marshal came to Bitter Creek on a Thursday. It was not because Cole sent for him, because he had not. It was because Rosa Delgado had written a letter to every lawman, every reporter, and every politician she could think of in 3 different languages. One of those letters got to a man who still thought the badge on his chest stood for something. Marshal Thomas Blackburn rode into town on a bay horse with 3 deputies right behind him. He was a thin man with a tough face and gray eyes that looked like they had stared down plenty of rattlesnakes and had never once blinked. He wore his star like it was no big deal, the way a carpenter wears his hammer. It was not for show. It was a tool for the job. He went to find Rosa first, because Rosa was the one who wrote the letters and Rosa was the one who knew what was going on. Then he found Cole and Clara and Gideon and all the proof they had collected. He spent 4 hours looking through everything with the slow patience of a man who knew you win your fights with paperwork, not with guns. This ledger by itself is enough to get a warrant for his arrest, Blackburn said. The photographs back up the story of the conditions. The little girl's testimony, what there is of it, and the statement from the guard will finish the job. He looked over at Cole. You went onto that property without any legal right. I did. If Keene's lawyers are any good, they'll say this evidence was gathered illegally. Then we have to get more. We have to get those children out. Let them tell their story. Blackburn nodded his head. That is what I was thinking. We ride out tomorrow. Cole did not go with them. This was the hardest choice he had ever had to make. It was harder than quitting the Rangers, harder than pouring out his last bottle of whiskey, harder than anything except for the day he came home and found Miriam and Daniel were gone. There were children on that ranch who needed to be saved, and every part of him that was a ranger screamed at him to saddle his horse and go. But Emmy was here, and he had learned the hard way, the way he seemed to learn everything, that the person right in front of you is more important than the fight waiting for you down the road. I am staying, he told Blackburn. The girl needs me to be here. Blackburn looked at him for a long moment. I understand. Cole stood on Clara's porch and watched the marshal and his deputies ride south. He felt something that he did not expect to feel. He felt relief. He was making a choice to stay. He was choosing a person over a duty, for the very first time in his life. Clara came and stood beside him. That was not easy, she said. No, but it was the right thing to do. I sure hope so. It was right, Cole. They waited. For 2 days they waited, and those 2 days felt like 2 long years. Emmy seemed to know that something big was happening. She stayed close to Cole, closer than she had ever let herself get before. She would sit on the porch if he was on the porch, and move to the kitchen if he went to the kitchen. She was always where he could see her, always close enough to touch. Dust followed them both around like a furry little shadow. On the 2nd day, Emmy said her 2nd word. She was sitting on the fence of the corral, watching Maverick eat his oats. Cole was standing right next to her, not talking, just being there. And she said in a very soft voice, "Horse." Cole turned his head to look at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at Maverick. But you could just barely see the hint of a smile on her face, like a little bit of sunshine peeking through the cloud. You got that right, Cole told her. That there is a horse. Horse, Emmy repeated. The word sounded new and strange on her tongue. Then she stretched out her hand and rested it on Maverick's big nose. The horse breathed out, warm against her skin, and the faint hint of a smile on her face turned into a real one. Marshal Blackburn rode back into town on a Saturday evening. He came with his deputies pulling 2 extra wagons behind them. Inside those wagons were children, 11 of them all together. They were skinny and scared, blinking in the sunset like critters that had been kept in the dark too long. The youngest one was 6 years old. The oldest was no more than 12. Every single one of them had the marks of a hard road, bruises and scars, and that guarded look you see in someone who has been treated like property. The townsfolk began to gather. Women hurried out with blankets and plates of food. Gideon opened his general store and gave away whatever was needed. Rosa cleared out the whole saloon, turning it into a makeshift shelter. Even the people who had claimed they saw nothing, who went about their days while kids were vanishing from their own county, they all stepped up to help. A heavy conscience can make a person act right. Blackburn found Cole on the porch. "Keene is under arrest," the marshal said. "We got to his house and he was there, just eating his breakfast." He placed his fork down, wiped his mouth with a cloth, got to his feet and asked to talk with his lawyer. Cool as water from a deep well. Did not raise his voice. Gave us no trouble at all. Blackburn shook his head. "In 30 years as a lawman, the ones who stay that calm are the ones that truly worry me." "Where is he now?" "In the county jail for the time being. He is being sent to the state penitentiary down in Huntsville to wait for his trial. The charges are mighty serious. Trafficking children, conspiracy, abusing his office. He is not going to see the other side of a prison wall ever again." "And what about Wade?" "He is cooperating. Told us everything he knows for a lighter sentence. He will do his time at the county lockup, probably about 3 years. The marshal paused for a long moment. "There is something else you ought to know." Cole's knuckles turned white where he gripped the porch railing. "There were 11 children at that ranch. One of them, he says his name is Daniel Brennan." The whole world just went quiet. The breeze died down. The sounds from town disappeared. Everything went still except for Cole's heart, which was hammering so loud he could feel it in his jaw. "Daniel Brennan," Marshal Blackburn said again, his eyes fixed on Cole's face. 10 years old, scrawny, mad as a hornet, and alive. The marshal let that hang in the air. "He told us he doesn't have a father." Cole had to sit down on the porch step. His legs just gave out from under him. The rain had passed hours before. The sky was scrubbed clean, a bright and endless blue that looked like it was making promises it couldn't keep. Somewhere down south, riding in a wagon toward Bitter Creek, was his son. A son who was alive and wanted nothing to do with him. Cole covered his face with both hands and just took a breath. That was all there was to do. Breathe and wait. The boy who climbed out of the marshal's wagon didn't look a thing like the son Cole carried in his memory, but he looked exactly like the man Cole saw in the mirror every morning. He had the same stubborn jaw, the same wary eyes. He even stood the same way, with his weight rocked back on his heels, ready to run at a moment's notice. Daniel Brennan was only 10 years old, but he was already a master at not trusting a single soul. Cole stood on the boardwalk in front of Rose's saloon and just watched his son get down from that wagon. He didn't run to him. He didn't shout his name. He didn't do a single thing that every nerve in his body was screaming at him to do. He just stood there and let the boy see him, letting him decide what would happen next. Daniel scanned the town with cold, calculating eyes. His clothes were way too big, draping over bony shoulders. His hair was long and tangled. A scar cut across his left hand, one that wasn't there 3 years ago. He looked at the buildings, the folks milling around, the big Texas sky, and then his eyes landed on Cole. For a split second, he recognized him. Then something harder slammed down in its place. "Daniel," Cole said, his voice steady. "I know who you are," the boy answered. His voice was raspy, deeper than a 10-year-old's ought to be. "Ma showed me your picture. Can we talk for a minute?" "Talk about what? About where you've been for 3 years? About how you let Ma sell me to those folks? Or about how you picked a bottle over your own son?" Daniel's voice broke on that last word. It was the only crack in the armor, showing a little boy who had been hurt in ways that don't leave scars on the skin. Cole didn't make excuses. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't explain that Miriam had lied, that he'd been searching everywhere, that he never knew. None of that would mean a thing. Not to a 10-year-old boy who'd spent months at a labor camp thinking his own father had tossed him aside like garbage. "You've got every right to be angry," Cole said quietly. "I wasn't there for you. Wasn't there. No matter the reason, I wasn't there when you needed me. That's on me." Daniel just stared at him. His jaw was tight, his hands were clenched into tight little fists. Behind him, Blackburn's deputies were helping the other children out of the wagons. Clara was there with blankets, and Rosa was barking orders like a field general. Daniel turned his back and walked straight into the crowd. He never once looked back. Cole stood on that boardwalk and watched his son vanish, and he didn't go after him. He just stuck his hands in his pockets, took a breath, and waited. Because that's what you do. You wait. You stay put. You make yourself available, and you let the wounded animal come to you when it's good and ready. Clara came and stood beside him. She didn't have to ask what happened. She could read it all over his face. "He'll come around," she said softly. "Maybe he will." "He's alive, Cole. An hour ago, you didn't even know that much. He is alive, and he's right here. The rest of it just takes time." "Time," he repeated. "Time and patience. Two things you're getting better at." That evening, they all had supper together. It was Clara and Cole, Emmy and Daniel, and Gideon and Rosa, all squeezed around Clara's little kitchen table. It was too small for 6 people, but not a single one of them cared. Gideon brought a loaf of bread. Rosa brought a big pot of stew. Clara had made a skillet of cornbread. The food was plain, and there wasn't quite enough to go around, but it was the finest meal any of them had ever had. Daniel sat at the very end of the table, putting as much space between himself and Cole as he could in that tiny room. He ate like a machine, never looking up, never saying a word. But he was there. He was at the table. He wasn't hiding out in some corner or refusing to step inside. He was there, and that was something. Emmy sat right next to Daniel. She didn't pester him or try to make him talk. She just ate her food, slipped bits to her dog dust under the table, and did what she did best. She waited. And when Daniel's hand came to rest on the table, she simply placed her piece of drawing charcoal next to it. She wasn't offering it to him, she just left it there. Daniel glanced at the charcoal. Then he looked at Emmy. She just gave a little shrug. He picked up the piece of charcoal. He rolled it between his fingers. And then, so quietly you could barely see him do it, he started to sketch on the wooden edge of the table. It was a horse. Just a few simple lines, but you could tell what it was. A horse running free, its mane flying back, its legs stretched out in a full gallop. Emmy watched him. Then she pulled another piece of charcoal from her own pocket, the one she kept with her always, and drew right next to his horse. She drew a dog. It was running right alongside the horse, its ears flopping, its tongue hanging out. Daniel looked down at her drawing. Then he looked at her. Something in his face changed. It wasn't a smile, but it was the place where a smile might one day decide to grow. Later that night, long after the children were asleep, Emmy in her corner with dust and Daniel on a pallet Clara had laid out in the kitchen, Cole and Clara sat on the porch. The sky was clearer than it had been in a week, washed out by the storm, and now packed with stars that felt close enough to pluck. Cole told Clara the whole story. About finding Daniel's name in that ledger. About Miriam. About the string of choices that led his son right into the same hell Emmy had just escaped. Clara just listened. When he was done, she said, "The ranch. The bank turned down my application today. They said without Keen's signature, the transfer can't happen. The new judge won't go near anything with Keen's name on it for years. I'm sorry, Clara. I know how much that place meant to you." She was quiet for a moment. She looked back at the little house behind them, small and packed with people. It meant I was still Henry's wife, that some piece of that old life was still real. She took a breath. Maybe I don't need it to be real anymore. Maybe I need something else to be real now. Cole looked at her. In the starlight, her face was strong and tired and beautiful, the way real things are beautiful, not perfect, but true. He kissed her. It was a quick, awkward kiss that tasted like coffee and road dust. There were no fireworks, no violins started playing. It was just two people, both broken in their own ways, deciding that trying was a whole lot better than giving up. That a messy kind of love was better than a perfect kind of lonely. From inside the house, they heard a small sound. It was a very quiet whisper. I think they like each other. It was Emmy, talking to dust. It was the longest sentence she had ever spoken. Clara and Cole looked at each other, and something happened to Cole's face that he hardly recognized. It was a smile. A small, shaky smile, rusty after 3 years of not being used. But it was real. 6 months went by. The seasons turned. The harsh Texas summer finally gave way to a fall that smelled of cedar smoke and cool dirt. And then came a winter that was mild compared to up north, but still cold enough for a fire every night, and extra blankets on all the beds. Judge Solomon Keene was found guilty on 14 counts and was sentenced to 25 years in the state prison down in Huntsville. He took the sentence standing tall, his face a blank mask, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He never said a word. He never apologized. They led him away in chains, and the courtroom was dead silent. Sheriff Wade Hobbs got 3 years in the county jail. He cooperated with everything, naming names, pointing out buyers, and giving up the details that helped track down all 38 children from Keene's ledger. 34 of them were found alive. 4 had died in the mines. The story didn't pretty up that part. Not every rescue gets there in time. Not every wrong thing can be made right. Cole and Clara got married on a Saturday morning in the little chapel in Bitter Creek. It was a small affair. Gideon read the verses. Rosa stood up as their witness. Emmy sat right in the front pew with Dust and Daniel beside her. She held Daniel's hand because she wanted to, and he let her because sometime in those 6 months he had stopped pulling away from another person's touch. Gideon said later it was the first time he had ever read from the scripture, and actually felt like he believed the words he was saying. Cole officially adopted Emmy. The papers were signed by the new county judge, a fella named Hartwell, who was sent down from Austin for the very reason that he didn't know a soul in Bitter Creek. Emma Brennan. All legal and proper. No one was bought or sold. Daniel and Cole, well, they were still a work in progress. The boy hadn't forgiven his father. He might never forgive him all the way. But he'd stopped tensing up every time Cole walked into a room. He would sit on the porch in the evenings instead of hiding out in his bedroom. He let Cole teach him how to rope, standing out in the corral with the horse Maverick, the rope feeling clumsy in his hands, his face all tight with focus. He gripped Cole's wrist when Cole reached out to fix his throw, and he didn't look at his father when he did it, but he held on. He held on. The boy still called him sir, not pa. Cole figured it might be a long while, or maybe even forever before that day came. And that was just fine. A door had opened between them, and that was enough for now. Cole put his hands to work building a saddle for Emmy. It was a special design, one they had sketched out together on Clara's kitchen floor what felt like ages ago. He modified it with extra straps for safety, and built in more support to help her twisted leg. He fitted it onto Maverick on a beautiful spring morning, when the hills were covered in wildflowers, and the air carried the scent of rain and fresh grass. Emmy's first time riding was not exactly smooth. She nearly tumbled off a couple of times. At one point, the saddle slid sideways, but Cole was right there to catch her. A little yelp of surprise escaped her, but then it melted into a real laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes deep from the belly, loud and free, with nothing held back. It was the sound of a little girl who had finally let go of the fear that something awful was just around the corner. Dust trotted alongside them, barking with pure happiness, while Daniel watched from his seat on the fence. Clara stood on the porch of their home, and the whole morning felt golden and warm and messy and perfectly alive. One Tuesday in the late spring, Cole was riding Maverick home after a long day's work. The Texas road beneath him was still warm and dusty, the very same road it had always been. It was the same stretch of dirt where he had discovered a terrified little girl, a loyal dog, and the entire next chapter of his life. As he neared the house, Dust came running out to greet him, his tail wagging so hard his entire body shook with the effort. Then Emmy came out onto the porch, waving with a bright look on her face. After her came Daniel, hesitant but still there, leaning against a porch post with his arms folded. Then Clara appeared, drying her hands on her apron, and giving him a smile that made Cole forget he had been working since sunrise. Cole had not said a word to another soul for 8 hours, and for the very first time in his life, he found that he hated the quiet. Later that evening, Emmy sat on the porch railing with Dust resting at her feet. From inside, she could hear Cole and Clara cooking supper, playfully arguing over who made worse cornbread, their voices warm and jumbled together. Daniel sat reading in a corner, trying to look like he was not listening, but a smile touched his lips when he thought no one was looking. Emmy gazed down the Texas road. She thought back to the day Cole had found her there. The coyote, the loud crack of the gun. The silence she had wrapped herself in because words had never fixed anything before. These days she talked. Not a whole lot, mind you. She still found comfort in being quiet, but she used her voice when it counted. She wished Maverick a good morning every single day. She always told Clara thank you after they ate. She called Cole Pa, and every last time she said it, his eyes would light up as if he were hearing it for the very first time. Emmy did not see herself as a girl who had been saved. She saw herself as someone who had made a choice. She had chosen to put her trust in people again. She had chosen to let them get close. She had chosen to speak when staying silent would have been much easier. And Cole, he had not saved her. He had simply stopped. That was the whole of it. He had made the choice to stop instead of just riding on by. Sometimes just taking a moment to stop is all it takes. Dust raised his head, his ears twitching at some distant sound from the road. Emmy gave him a good scratch behind them until he calmed down. There was nothing coming down that path. Nothing was amiss. The road was only a road, the dust was only dust, and her home was right here. It was imperfect and noisy, filled with people who were still figuring out how to be a family. She leaned her head back against the porch railing, shut her eyes, and just listened to her father laugh at something Clara had said. It was a wonderful sound. It was the very best sound. And for the first time in her whole life, Emmy Brennan was not just waiting for it all to be over. Our team puts a great deal of heart into creating these stories, making sure each one offers something valuable and leaves you with a meaningful lesson. We carefully shape every tale to be entertaining, uplifting, and encouraging for our listeners. It is our firm belief that powerful stories have the ability to change people's lives, and our promise is to always provide you with content that resonates. We are so grateful you have chosen to be a part of our audience.